When we got locked into COVID last semester, and we had to go home and do everything from the house, I said, you know what, I'm going to sit down and read this. He won a Nobel Prize for Literature, this Albert Camus, so he's probably a pretty decent writer. So Camus, he's Nobel Prize. I was like, you know what, I can read a book by this guy, right? And I actually fell in love with it, right? I'm not going to become a Camus scholar, so this is just kind of my reflections on some of that book, some of the other things I've read, some articles I've read about him. He's growing on me as somebody who offers some very nice insights into the human condition that I think actually my discipline of an analytic philosophy, even a philosophy of science, is never going to quite get to, because he's dealing with it, on the ground, so to speak. In terms of his time, his place, and whatever, but he wrote things that actually kind of can speak to us today. So here's how this talk got formulated, just some motivation on my end. I was in lockdown. It forced me to think about the pandemic in relation to actually the kind of first article of the Creed. So even though I'm a philosopher, I am in Christ College, and my first degree was theology, and I was doing something for a church on the first article, which is, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. How does that work when you've got, literally little tiny bugs that we'll talk about trying to kill you, and bugs that you can't see? They're inside you. They're taking over your DNA and your RNA processes. That's nuts, right? So that got me all thinking crazy. Then I read Camus' The Plague and The Myth of Sisyphus, and I read his Nobel Speech Prize, and he had this to say, which just really kind of it hit me as this captures something true about this world, even if Camus is going to come at it from a different angle. This is what he said to the people he was reading his speech to. They, and these are the people, so he grew up in the World War II era. He was part of the French resistance during occupied France, when it was occupied by the Germans in World War II, and he was part of this kind of movement to kind of, resist them. And he's reflecting back on that, and he says the people I grew up with, the people I suffered with, the people I saw die, they had to forge for themselves an art of living in times of catastrophe in order to be born a second time to fight openly against the instinct of death that's at work in our history. And he brought forward this idea of an art of life versus the instinct of death. And I really had to kind of think through an art of life, how to live when everything around me is dying and I'm actually dying and everything we do is death. Humans are good at death, right? So then I listened to the Cui Bono Professor of the Year lecture by Dr. Koenig, and she started, and alongside the president as well, they gave talks discussing kind of liberal arts as preparing us for questions of life and death. And then also the reminder that the times we're going through, in spite of it being so awkward, these aren't really that unprecedented. People have lived through and flourished, this is straight from Dr. Koenig's speech, despite the messes we find ourselves in just living life, all right? This parlayed into Dr. Armstrong's opening Cui Bono lecture, where he talked about Concordia as a micro-city. And this actually, the last kind of wheel in the puzzle, so to speak, or the last piece of the puzzle that fell into place was when Kaylee was asking questions, Tim was asking questions, Savannah, if you're here or you're listening in the ether, you guys were asking questions like, what do we do? When is it right to obey? When is it right to disobey the government and things like that, right? And how do we motivate people to do things? And so just that struggling with obedience and disobedience and whatnot, and the fact that we're living together in some kind of little micro-community really got me kind of, again, thinking about how Camus might be able to help us with those kinds of questions of how I live and who are my neighbors. So let me start then on that first part, right? This is my kind of thesis. It's not really a thesis. It's not a well-formed thesis, but these are maybe my observations. And I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but I want to put it up front so we can kind of come back to it maybe in conversation. Human beings strive after conceptions of the good, the true, and the beautiful, but our forgetfulness makes tyrants of us all. The path forward is to remember who we are and the communities we discover ourselves within. All right? That's my Camusian observation. That's not necessarily coming from me. It's me interpreting what Camus is going to kind of tell us. So start with the coronavirus, right? COVID-19. This is a shared experience for all of us, right? If you've heard any of the kind of the data, the science on it, not talking about what's going on in our society, but just what a coronavirus is, it's a crown-shaped thing. There's 4 groupings of them that are related to kind of just common colds, right? So we've all had coronaviruses in the past, most likely, but there's 3 that really made headlines, and they're actually 3 that you probably remember hearing stories about. SARS, 2003, MERS, 2012, and then SARS-CoV-2-19 novel coronavirus, what's happening right now. Now, viruses are really actually cool kind of biological entities because they straddle that line between living and non-living in just amazingly awesome and scary ways, right? So if you remember back to your high school bio, or you remember your bio, whatever our class is for bio for majors or whatever, you know that these things, they're not like plague. They're not like bacterias. They don't have a life of their own, in a weird way to say that, right? Because they can't reproduce, they can't replicate. So they have to take over your system, right? They cannot actually do it without a host. And they do that in, again, this kind of amazingly awesome and scary way by hijacking your cellular structures. Now, if I was going to go theology, I would take this straight to the Garden of Eden and the thorns and the thistles and all that kind of good stuff in terms of the fact that you literally have, like, thorns, because they're not living things, kind of, working at your cellular level to kill you. I mean, talk about the garden working against you and the land working against you. We're talking at the most minute level is the world attacking us, right? So this is, again, awesome and absurd in the true sense of those words, where you've got viruses at work on our cellular level, but then also the amazing way that this virus brought society to its knees and literally brought everything we know to be good, to be true, to be beautiful, crashing down. There's not one of you in here who's a freshman who experienced a normal high school graduation. I was asking some students whether like senior travel trips are still a thing. It's like, no, those are gone, right? It was a unprecedented, to not use that word lightly, kind of situation that caused us to kind of readjust everything that we had to do and everything we took to be true and good and beautiful in a matter of weeks. Okay, so this kind of, raised questions in, like, how do we flourish in conditions that are so absurd? Like, how do we actually flourish? How do we get on as humans? And this is what brought me then into the second part, where I was like, well, let me pick up a nihilistic existentialist philosopher, because he'll help, right? It turns out he's not nihilistic, but I read The Plague. And just, again, you don't need to know the background of the story. It's worth reading. It's short, right? But you've got the characters. It takes place in Algeria, which is a kind of North African, French, what's the right word? Country, colony, territory, right? And they do actually suffer from various outbreaks. So a little bit more, I think, geared at the cholera. Every 20 years they're getting taken out, large portions of the city. So it's a real city. It's a fictional story in a real city, right? But Camus played with this idea of the plague arising in this city, and then just it's a psychological, sociological, philosophical tour de force of just what humans do when you get forced into a serious lockdown and people are dying all around you, right? So just the main characters, you got Bernard Roux, who's a doctor. You got Jean Taro, who's a friend. He's also an outsider who gets stuck there. You got Joseph Grand, who's a civil servant. You got your average Joe. You got Raymond Rambert, who's an outside kind of young, flashy journalist. And you got this Cottard, who's a kind of a shady black market character. He does a lot of shady dealings when all the stuff hits the fan. And then you got Father Panelau, who's the Jesuit priest. So you got the church in there. And I only say that, not again so that we're going to dive into these actual characters and do like a character study, but kind of like what I do with Socrates, for some of you who have had my class, you have literally the entirety of humanity represented in these characters. They're there. Like, this is us. The city is us. All right? And you'll find yourself resonating to certain characters, what they say, what they do, and how they deal with this extremely kind of stressful situation. But I'm going to pull out my favorite quote, which is actually the very last. I sent this around to some faculty members at the beginning of summer, that kind of brings the story to an end, right? So the story unfolds, the plague as kind of what's happening with coronavirus right now, the infection rates, the death rates all start dropping, people return to what they considered the normal life, they're back out in the streets, they're in the parks, they're walking, the death, the mass graves are being covered and hidden so people can return to kind of just living. And this is what the doctor, who's kind of the hero of the story, Bernard Roux, this is what he says. He says, and indeed, as he listened, as the doctor listened to the cries of joy rising from the town, Roux remembered that such joy is always imperiled. He knew that those jubilant crowds knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture, linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, bookshelves, and that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightenment of men, it would rouse up its rats and send them forth to die in a happy city. And basically, the plague process would start over. Now, that's not a happy thought, right? That doesn't make me feel good. But Camus is tapping into something about, again, just the way the world works, that we got to turn to kind of his more developed philosophy, if you can call it that, to kind of help unpack a little bit. Camus is what we call an absurdist, and he's kind of, again, the end of that story is playing with the absurdity of the situation. We're all coming out to play again, but we're going to be forced right back into some sort of recognition of death at some point in our lives, because the rats will rise again. And if it's not the rats, maybe it's totalitarianism, maybe it's ideology. Whatever it is, it's going to come back, and it's going to destroy what we have thought and what we have built to be good, true, and beautiful. So turn quickly with me to his more philosophical, probably one of his most philosophical essays, called The Myth of Sisyphus. And I used to start my freshman classes this way, but then I got nervous because the higher-ups would tell me and show me reports that, like, suicidal thoughts and suicides are on the rise amongst you cats. And so I got nervous, like, should I actually be starting this way? Because this is another way that Camus, again, working through the absurdity of the world, he says, look, there's really only one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. And he's basically, if you take what I just said about the myth, the rats rising again, he's telling us, he's saying, if you take that seriously, if you take what I'm saying seriously, there is nothing beyond your life in a meaningless world. I mean, this is taking us right to the void. We're staring into it, and he says, really, the only question worth asking is, why do I keep going? Now, his answer is positive. His answer is not, yeah, that's right. Okay, talk over, done. Right? There's more to it, but it's going to kind of cast a light into how maybe we can get on with each other in terms of a society in the pluralistic world that we live in. So how does he kind of come to any sort of closure on that? Why not oft ourselves as the kind of appropriate response to the way the world is? Well, he says this towards the end, and this is if you know the myth of Sisyphus from a Dr. Armstrong class or just reading Greek myths, he was the guy who pushed the rock up, rolled down, pushed the rock up, rolled down. So here was the insight for Camus. At that subtle moment when Sisyphus glances backward over his life. Let me just read what he says. At that subtle moment when man glances back over his life, Sisyphus returning to the rock, so coming down the hill, it's in that slight pivoting he contemplates the series of unrelated actions which become his fate, created by him, combined under his memory, and soon sealed by his death. And we must imagine Sisyphus happy. All right, well, I'm done. I'll see you guys. No, I mean, this is heavy, right? I mean, so that's it? That's all life is pushing a rock up, building a dream to watch it come crashing back down? And again, that seems to say, yeah, okay, if that's it, I'm out. But he's challenging us to see it that actually there's something to at least and important to being able to recognize that a lot of what is happening around us is completely and utterly out of our control, right? And this is where I want to draw out a little bit more philosophical on it in terms of what I call Camusian absurdity actually is. So take those two quotes for what they are. One about the fact that even when we come out from the other side of some kind of pandemic, there's something else, whether it's the rats again or something else is going to come right back in and fill whatever it is we just defeated. Couple that with kind of the way he takes life to be. We're all Sisyphuses pushing our rocks up and running and watching them come crashing down around us, and you get this kind of again a bleak picture of reality. But here's how he's going to unpack it again as a kind of a philosopher. So if you look at absurd, what the term absurd is in any kind of dictionary, you're going to get the first definition is always going to be something like wildly unreasonable, illogical, inappropriate. Okay. Definition 2, arousing amusement or derision, ridiculous. All right. Then you learn, though, that Camus, he's not quite a classicist, but he spent a lot of time reading classics. And he had a penchant for languages, so to speak. So you look at the Latin root for absurdus, and I could call Dr. Armstrong and he'd give you a 40-minute lecture on that. But you got the word absurdus. And the Latin root of the word literally just means out of tune. So a Camusian absurdity, it doesn't have to do with kind of radically illogical, radically inappropriate, unreasonable. It has nothing to do with amusement and derision and ridiculousness. I mean, it's there in a sense, but I think what Camus is really tapping into here is the fact that most of our lives are out of tune. They're not quite jiving right? And in fact, we're the ones who are often getting in the way of allowing our lives to kind of jive right? So what does this mean? Well, for him, the world, this out of tuneness is the world, and this isn't a presupposition, assumption that he makes, is completely and utterly silent to ultimate concerns and truth. And you got to remember, he's coming out of World War II. He lived an occupation. He's seen how bad it gets, right? Nothing compared to our little lockdown that we've had to structure with here, right? He's seen how bad humanity goes. So he's stepping out on the other side, and he's looking at it and saying, you know what? The world could care less about your ideals of what is good, true, and beautiful. They're simply not there. But you do care. The self does care. And we have this almost, and he uses the language of eros, which if you know anything about the loves, if you've read Lewis or if you've taken any of your kind of, again, some of your language course, eros is that kind of passionate sexual love. And he says, but we as humans have an eros for beauty. And he understands beauty as a kind of unity of thought, like a unity in truth. Like we extremely and utterly desire. Now, I know for those of us in a Christian university, you're going, yeah, this is like, dude, this is like Christianity. But you got to remember, the guy is going to grasp, but he's never going to quite get there. But this is why, I'm looking at going, this is pretty amazing stuff for somebody to kind of fight through this in their own heads and kind of get so close, right? But we have this we have this need for order in the world. And so what absurdity becomes for Camus is it pits that kind of modern recognition of the limits of our capacities to, and this is important, anthropomorphically or providentially explain the world. So that drive for beauty creates an anthropomorphizing of it, a philosophizing of it. The Democrats are right, and they're the only ones who can be right. The Republicans are right, and they're the only ones. This is where ideology turns into religion, or any philosophical system of thought turns into religion, right? We can anthropomorphize it, or we can do it providentially. So he's going after religion. He's going after the cosmic and the gnomic. He's going after the supernatural and the natural. I don't care what side of this equation you fall on. If it's all about God, if it's all about Darwin, it doesn't matter. It's all a house of cards. And we explain that world against a performative means like this is what I do, a performatively indubitable desire for that very explanation. You might have heard the word zealot. Essentially, Camus charging us and saying, you are all actually zealots. Even though you think you're the most even-keel person in the world, you're actually a zealot because you have this desire for beauty against a world that could care less about what your desire for beauty is. But we force the world into our box, right? So Camus, this is, again, still we're not kind of happy, I know, but this is Camus just kind of describing the human condition here. And his answer to this is very classical in nature. So my freshman year reading Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. For those of you who I've had in the past, you've read this stuff. And for anyone who's done the core here has had to struggle with these readings in some sense. And Camus, ironically, this is for me ironically, because he didn't go down the nihilistic existentialist route I thought he would go. He actually turned back to the Greeks and said, those guys were pretty smart. They don't have the answer on this one because they're kind of arrogant, right? They're going to fall into, they're playing the same game of the world and the eros for beauty and the mismatch between that. But they did have this in play, and you find it in all of them, whether it's the skeptics, the Stoics, the atomists, the Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. They realize that one has to measure or moderate your passions. You have to moderate them, right? And we just had this conversation a little bit today in my freshman class, that part of the problem in the apology is a problem with people being too passionate, right? So it's not that he wants to eradicate them and get them out, because he's a French philosopher. They love this stuff. They're the founders of kind of like contemporary emotional philosophy. But you need to balance it and counter it and check it. Because each passion, this is Camus, noble enough in itself becomes murderous if it's not limited by other passions. All right? And this creates an insane tension in the soul, an insane tension with the self in our desire for action, in our desire to fix, say, the injustices of the world, versus our desire to kind of creatively withdraw and just contemplate beauty. Because when the world makes sense is when I'm by myself thinking about it. It's when I put those ideas and I put that action into play that I run into the truth of the world that I could care less. And this is a constant tension. Again, you might bring up the theological tropes of saint and sinner. Yeah, it's there in this kind of secularized way, right? So how do we cultivate this? This is where Camus really is going to play hard on the idea of memory, because memory becomes important in terms of a fidelity to that absurdity. We tend to forget the passion, that eros tends to forget that the world is absurd. We tend to think, another way to say this in a positive fashion is we tend to think we're winning, whatever side you're on. And we can't see how we're actually losing, right? And so we have to cultivate this fidelity to absurdity. And it's actually the forgetfulness when the righteous become tyrants. So it's in those moments that we forget, and we're going to push our ideology, our understanding, our conceptions of truth, good, and beauty. When we push those in the face of, I'll use now science language, recalcitrant data, that we run into this idea that like data that doesn't fit into the model, but we're going to push the model regardless, right? We forget, because we forget that, of course, there's going to be recalcitrant data for every model. None of the models are as big as reality. Reality is always bigger than the models we create, right? So now here I'm going to slow down and I'm going to pose a counterexample that my good friend Dr. Lou posed to me, because he says, "How the hell do you get motivation out of this?" Now, I still don't see how this actually motivates me to do anything start curving this conversation towards where that third part with the different speeches I listened to. So there are kind of two responses. There's the response that was actually given by our president, by Dr. Koenig, and by Dr. Armstrong. And it's a perfectly and right and just response, and that is kind of the Christian response. Of course, right, there's hope in this world. We know the models never cover reality, because the model actually became reality in Jesus Christ and exploded it from within, right? And insofar as you have that and you have a theological worldview, every single one of you is actually a cosmic being. Every single one of you. And insofar as you're a cosmic being, I actually have motivation. You're not just a being that's here temporarily. You're here, literally, you're going to live forever in some way, shape, or form. And that should motivate me to say, you know what? I should be kinder to you. I should be nicer to you. I should help. I need to do things for my neighbor, right? That's a theological conception. That's not where Camus is going, though. So I'm going to bracket that one because it was covered well in the last couple talks, right? And let's see if we can't try to motivate some sort of secular version of that. And the point here is not that we should go one way or the other. In my long game, the point here would be to try to promote some sort of conversation across the camps, right? Because if we're going to get through this life together, we're not going to be stuck at a place that's all Christians. We're not going to be stuck at a place that's all atheist. We're not going to be stuck at a place that's all of our camp. That will never, ever, if you want that, you need to go join a monastery or a nunnery. And that's exactly kind of what the Lutherans said. No, screw that. We're out of there. That didn't work out so hot, right? Maybe it did for Luther. He found a wife that way. But anyways, this is not what we're going to, like, that's not, we're going to have to struggle alongside the secularists, the atheists, the agnostics, and everyone else. So how does Camus maybe help cultivate a different way of approaching this problem where we might be able to motivate? And remember, this is all, the counterexample is there's no motivation here. Nihilism, everyone always says, Camus is just a nihilist and absurdist, get him out of here. He's actually got some tools, I think, to help cultivate a conversation with people who don't think from that kind of Christian context. So remember, he starts that myth of Sisyphus with the question, why? I mean, this again, how do I do this? Don't kill yourself, right? It's not suicide, it's an art of life. Okay, so how does that work? Well, the Sisyphusian task of building and breaking and building and breaking and building and breaking and learning how to be happy in that moment when you're walking back down to build again, for Camus, and this is what the plague, and we'll jump back into the plague here soon, what the plague illustrates so well. For Camus, the one thing he said, that I don't care who you are, the one thing that we all share in this life, no matter what our social stratification, no matter what our socioeconomic background, no matter what our religious beliefs are, no matter where we find ourselves, the one question that every single one of us, and we have to come to terms with this individually, this is why people also kind of put them off into the existentialists a little bit, is that you are going to die. That death is real, and that at some point, and it could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 20 years, it could happen in 5, 50, 80. The tenseness of that thing that is death that we tend to avoid and hide, especially here in Orange County. I mean, where's the nearest cemetery? I think there's a pet cemetery in Huntington Beach, and there's cemeteries down in Lake Forest. But other than that, I don't think there's any cemeteries in Irvine. And it wouldn't surprise me to learn that was something that was planned by the Irvine Company, because we don't like this, right? But for Camus, he thought this, and again, contextually, he's coming out of World War II. But for Camus, this was the defining piece that one had to come to terms with, because it's only in death that no matter how great you are or have been or will be, it all goes away in an instant. No matter how horrible you are, no matter how weak you've been, no matter how much you've failed, all that goes away in an instant. All right? And Camus also suffered with tuberculosis. He was on death's door a few times. So again, he's really reflecting hard on this in terms of his life. And he's saying, look, once you come to grips with that, you can look at every single triumph and failure, the rock going up, the rock coming down. You can come at that and say, you know what? None of that actually matters. There's a freedom that comes from this. And so for Camus, once we can, and this is a very stoic move, so I mean, he's pulling a lot from the ancient world. Once we can kind of disentangle ourselves, whatever that means, from the externals that we tend to think define us, we can now, for the first time, actually see other people as the same sorts of creatures that we are. They're no longer like the other who have this and have that and don't have this and don't have that or whatever. We no longer kind of look at you as I mean, to put it in Darwinian terms, competition, right? We don't have that. But I see you as a person who's struggling the actual same struggle that I'm struggling with, no matter what walk of life you're in. The externals might be different, but the struggle's the same. And that struggle is that absurdity, again, of me wanting to my passion for the beautiful and a world that just keeps beating me down. All right? We're literally the walking dead. Okay, so we're still not happy. All right, we're there. So what follows then, according to Camus, is in the Art of Life, and basically is saying, look, when we realize that, we're actually free now to alleviate some of the suffering that our neighbor suffers from. And again, this is going to get, it's a little wishy-washy if I take it as an analytic point in terms of, what follows according to Camus is this art of life that aims at helping one's neighbor to alleviate those pangs, not the death itself, but the pangs of death, right? This becomes, again, a kind of palliative care philosophy, a philosophy of trying to alleviate the tensions that surround death. And so the cultivation of this freedom is that kind of practice, that practice of Camusian virtue and a fidelity to the observed while we're moderating our deep desires for unity of the truth and the goodness and beauty. Because if I start going out there and opposing that, we're always going to have the divisions between whose conception, what's conception, right? And again, this is to put it into the classics, this is a know thyself moment. That know thyself moment kind of motivates us to push on despite the fact that we don't have a kind of ultimate cosmic hope that's waiting for us to either reward us or terrorize us. So I've now made good on my 3 parts of my observation. This is drawing me into my last kind of concluding thoughts on what to actually do. Camusian absurdity suggests that we have a deep desire for the good, the true, the beautiful, to act accordingly in the face of a world that remains silent to our pleas and actions. 2, if we do not temper our passions for such unity, then we are the tyrannical other that we are fighting against, in whatever way that happens. 3, the Camusian antidote is to live within the absurdity while helping others in their journey towards death. So what about that last bit about community then? That's the one piece I haven't actually touched on. So here's how the plague kind of helps us out. We get too bound up in the ultimates. And we forget, as we get bound up in the ultimates, that our neighbors are literally sitting beside us, right? So Camus offers for us images. He's not going to give us a prescription. He's not going to give us an algorithm. He's not going to give us, a utilitarian calculation. But he actually motivates us to turn and view the literal neighbor sitting next to us over and above the grand other that we're fighting against in most of our lives. And so the plague is a story about a cast of characters forced to live together under extreme circumstances. Their grand dreams, visions, hopes, desires all came crashing to a halt when they were forced to deal with the death and their exile and their quarantine. They had to live together in a micro-city of their larger lives. It's a story of reckoning with that Camusian absurdity as you watch them. All of their vices, all the characters' vices, all of their virtues were on display. There's no angelic, virtuous citizen here. But they came together to alleviate the suffering of the dying of those around. He cannot provide an algorithm for virtue in this wasteland, but instead he shows us what it is like to live in this situation. We recognize the good and the bad and the heroes while recognizing our neighbors literally live next to us, down the street from us, within the communities that we discover ourselves in, and we have to be able to discover these communities. He reminds us that all are dying, yet we are not humble enough to recognize it as we let our desires, our singular passions, make tyrants of us. Our inability to recall the absurdity of life blinds us to those dying around us, those in need of help now, not in some future ideal or unified state. It isn't so much a call to action as a recognition that the situations we find ourselves in, the neighbors we live with, are often out of our control. The measured life, that tempering my desire for something grander, the measured life is one extended to these neighbors and situations. It's not a paralyzing passion for the grand adventure, the large-scale change that only leads to frustration and ultimate neglect of neighbor, the rock up and down. Camus reminds us that la résistance starts in the self, turns towards the community where I'm located, and may or may not bubble beyond that. Dr. Armstrong was right to turn our attention to the community here at CUI as a micro-city when asking cui bono, to whose benefit. Dr. Koenig and our president turned our attention to the education as an exercise in understanding life and death through the liberal arts curriculum. President Thomas spoke of what's happening right now, conversation happening in the upper quads, in the rooms about these kinds of questions. And all three spoke to the liberating freedom gifted from Christ through forgiveness. But Camus reminds us that the humane art of living in the face of catastrophe is possible when the absurd is remembered and neighbors receive care. Camus offers a practical, everyday counter to that instinct of death that brings to mind a profane bel amore, an admirable, even if secular, beautiful love that seems so close, yet so far from that Christian vision of this actual university. Yet here we are, Christians, atheists, agnostics, the others, locked down due to losing our happy microcity to a virus, dealing death to all that was, except our ability to ask questions. How ought I to live, and who is my neighbor? And as we struggle to answer these questions, perhaps we also will stumble upon together an art of life against that instinct of death. Thank you.
All right, so my question is, what does philosophy think about, zodiac signs and, comparing it to, personality traits?
I don't know. In the history of science, the philosophers were the first ones to kind of kick that stuff out as knowledge. We kind of pushed it away, and then the scientists came and said, "Well, let's see if we can quantify it." And that when they started doing that, then they kicked the philosophers away, and some of us kind of still play in that mystical realm, but for the most part. The tradition of philosophy that I come from would view that as not necessarily any correlation that happens is just that, correlation, and there's not really much data for the causation of the signs relating to personality traits and whatnot. It's like the Farmer's Almanac. It kind of works sometimes, but then there's also a lot of cases where it doesn't work, and it's like, how do I decide between the two? Yeah.
So one thing on that is that
Please, Jeff.
it relates to what you were saying, and that we're all here together, and there's that weird sense in which we are a Christian university, and yet what you're saying is part of being a Christian university is turning your attention to your neighbor rather than always these abstract questions. That's the incarnation in Jesus, and that's also what the existentialists were doing. What's interesting about this, as it relates to the question, is that Martin Luther, when he started the Wittenberg project, he had a friend and a colleague named Philip Melanchthon, who was really into astrology. And Luther thought astrology was dumb. But instead of just running him out immediately, he said, all right, buddy, let's study twins. Let's see if this thing works. Let's see if the model has any legs. And when it didn't, it just died out on its own. Right. It did have a rationality to it. The zodiac they thought was going to be, like the moon. The moon obviously was affecting the tides, so they figured Mars. They didn't know exactly, how much of an effect it would have. But if you believe that, let's say, when women menstruate or when they're more likely to give birth has something to do with the moon, then it was reasonable, and they did not think of it as unscientific, that there be some effect on a child in the womb, but they had to play it out. And I think that's what's really fun. I mean, you had a very dark talk, but there really is something very liberating about saying, the meaning of life is life together. And that's both a Christian and an existentialist thing. Who's gonna get it? Yeah.
I'm going to see if I can think of how to formulate my question. So he kind of talked about how the plague is part of the human experience. Like we would like to formulate the human experience as something innately meaningful or beautiful or good. But the plague kind of illustrates to us that there are dark parts. So was there anything in the book that kind of said how they lived their lives before the period during the plague, and how was their human experience, or what they thought was their human experience, changed after the plague?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so unfortunately, it does not go into any post-conversation. Like, it literally ends with what I read you about the rats coming back into the city to die. So it ends on a downward note. And it doesn't spend a lot of time discussing pre-plague days, except that it was kind of your standard beach town, and it really probably wouldn't be too different from, say, Orange County. You've got your restaurants, you've got your nightlife. It's not Paris, but it's not. We're in Irvine, It's not Paris, but it's not like. Forgive me. It's not. Well, how about this? Because nobody ever comes from here. What's the city that when you're driving out to Vegas with a thermometer in the middle of it, and you just stop for Barstow? Baker. Yeah, it's not Baker, right? So there's things happening, right? But what it does do really well, if you just want to if you read it, you will be able to track almost the life stages of a community that we've actually all suffered through COVID. And again, this was 50 years, 70 years previous, right? 70 years. Never mind. But you can like he does it well. Like he just traces it because it's part. He had his finger, I guess, on just the kind of how the human operates. Not as a psychologist, right? He's not doing this formally. He's just observation. So all the different characters. The point I think that I really enjoyed, and he doesn't do this in The Plague. I had to pull this out of Camus and apply it to The Plague. Was that when catastrophe hits? I mean, at some point, you just kind of have to deal with it. And in the story, you get a lot of people who are trying not to deal with it. And the reason they're not trying to deal with it, and I didn't go down this route because the Jesuit priest, the reason they're not trying to deal with it is because they have the truth. They know that this city deserves to die, right? And there's a whole nice conversation in there where Father Roux and the priest get into this argument that basically, again, it's kind of the secular wins over the theologian, which is always kind of you got to be careful with that. But he does get if the priest actually cared about what he was saying, he would be out in the streets helping, but he's not. He's preaching every Sunday about death and destruction, and he should really be getting his hands dirty and helping with the dying, right? And so for all the characters, they have to come to terms with that, and it's when they come to terms with that, then all of a sudden they're doing things to help alleviate the suffering of the city versus just kind of scheming to get out or making money on the black market or whatever. And like I said, he's really good because none of them become like uber heroes. Like even Roux, the doctor, he's not a good guy. Like, and you don't come away thinking it's not like the way they do it sometimes in the movies where they make like the evil guy the good guy. It's nothing like that. These are just people that you would actually bump into in the street. We're like, wow, I really like what that guy's doing, but man, he treats his wife like crap, right? And so what it does is it presents a picture of humanity that's real, and I think his cultivation is that we're supposed to kind of read it and see that, because what you have there is nobody is saying, except for Camus saying this is the way we should think about it, right? None of them are coming up and saying this is the only way to do this, right? The guy who's running the black market deals, he's got value. He's also got vices. The doctor has value and vices. But we tend to fixate on what is good, and then we'll elevate that good to like a cosmic level and be like, yeah, that is the good. And the rats come back and tell us, nope, right? That's not. But in terms of kind of tracking the community's change or something like that, it's more kind of just descriptive in what's happening on the day-to-day.
The purpose of life is life from the secular perspective. To what degree would you say that lines up with the kind of mental struggle that we see Solomon go through in the book of Ecclesiastes?
I wouldn't surprise me one bit to know that Camus was well-versed with the wisdom literature and all that was going on. And, in fact, there is evidence, and I haven't read the story yet. I'm kind of itching to do it now. That there was a Catholic priest that he was actually really good friends with, and they got into, as you can see, there's a lot of theological, he reaches and he comes so close to like certain truths about that the theologian's sitting there going, yeah, duh, I could tell you that, but again, Camus can reach it in a way that the theologian never can because the theologian just kind of says it, right? I don't know about your specific question, but I do know that Camus was in a lot of theological conversation with certain people, and it would surprise me if he wasn't well versed in the wisdom literature, and in fact maybe even took some insight from what was happening in some of the wisdom literature. What he's really gonna revolt against, though, is using theology as kind of a crutch to basically kind of say this is how we're going to have to deal with this now, right? And that's where he's always going to push back.
So my question's like not COVID related, but for me, when looking at Camus, like I'm a big fan of him, but I feel like it's weird that we give him this like special absurdist designation when he's kind of a contemporary existentialist philosopher. And if you look at what he's saying, it's kind of lines up with Sartre a lot, and it lines up with Kierkegaard in a lot of ways too. Mm-hmm. And for me, I don't know where you draw the line between existentialism and absurdism.
I'm not going to be able to answer because I don't do existential philosophy, but I can say this because it did. I had to unlearn some things that I thought was going on with kind of existentialism and whatnot. And for him, the reason so I don't know the story, but he fell out with Sartre, right? And there's a whole book on their fighting and why Camus basically kicked Sartre to the curb, didn't kick him to the curb, but said, I'm not going down that route that you want me to go down, because basically what you're doing is putting existentialism now as like a new religion and a new ideology, and that's not what I'm talking about. You're falling in love with your passion for beauty and unity, right? Okay, I don't know the ins and outs of that, whether because sometimes people will say, like Camus could say that, but maybe Sartre was right. Maybe Camus really was just doing what he was doing, and without a kind of detailed analysis of what they actually thought and said, I have no idea. He also goes after Kierkegaard for the same thing. So he goes after Kierkegaard again. I'm reporting this kind of secondhand on things that I was looking at. He goes after Kierkegaard for the same sort of move, except with a God gloss to it, right? So for Kierkegaard, he was very critical of that kind of just leaping and falling into God.
Right, the leap of faith.
Yeah, he was like, no, that doesn't make sense. I mean, okay, I might as well just leap into death. That doesn't actually help me deal with what I'm struggling with on the ground, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, but again, I don't know enough about Kierkegaard's thought, and I don't know enough about really Camus' thought to navigate whether or not Camus is really just doing what Kierkegaard was doing, or Kierkegaard was really just doing what Camus was doing. That's the stuff of like MA theses and whatnot, right? If you want to get into it, so. Yeah, right. And I think my personal kind of opinion here on him, just reading what I've read, is, okay, absurdity, everybody can claim absurdity. I mean, if you take what he thinks it to be, he's like, we all know that our structures are, the way I was saying it in a more kind of philosophy of science way, that the world is bigger than our models. At some point, we all come to grips with that. And if that's just what absurdity is, okay. And my desire for like an actual order to my models to be the right models. But I see him really, what was really telling was the way he would draw the concepts forth from the ancients. He's really a eudaimonist. He's not an absurdist. He's a eudaimonist, but he's trying to strip away from the ancient Greeks that arrogance that they brought, Plato, Aristotle, even the skeptics and the Stoics, that they could actually attain it, that they could actually do it. And he's saying, I'm not so sure we can actually do it. Because once you get it, then I've got it. Then why do anything else? And so it kind of, for him, that was the demotivating factor. Because if you're the God, you become the God and you know it. Why do anything? Mm-hmm. All right. So he really pushed back on anything that was going to try to say that you could actually achieve the good, the true, and the beautiful, or think you could achieve it. Which again is why the motivation question is. So then why don't I just kill myself? Like that question is always going to come back to the forefront for Camus. And people are going to say, no, he doesn't answer it well, or he does answer it well. And I think a lot of the way you fall on that question is going to be for other reasons than just like the thought itself. Do I actually believe that there's a God? Do I not believe there's a God? That's going to influence, like the background's going to fall. I'm going to fall down one way versus the other. Right? So could one actually be a Camusian? He would probably say no, because that's me. That's what I did. Right? But here's my art of life, and what can you learn from it? Because he didn't want to give the algorithm. That's why all his plays, his stories, it was story form. He never actually wrote, except for the Myth of Sisyphus. He didn't write in a senior thesis on Augustine, believe it or not, in Plotinus. He didn't really write academic work. But it was good. He won him a Nobel Prize. I'll never do that.
This is a little rich coming from a sociologist, somebody who studies theory, but so I'm trying to put it on a student perspective. So COVID or life events are incredibly personal, and so they could listen to maybe a talk like this, and it seems very theoretical, of course, philosophical. It might seem sort of out there. How do you take knowledge like that, or a sociological perspective, a philosophical perspective in your world, and help the student make a connection between these events and the wisdom that philosophy can give you? Because there's maybe a bridge that has to be built. So how do you build that bridge?
So Camus, let me start kind of theoretical, and then I'll try to back it in. Because that's the end of my speech was where I was trying to back it into a little bit more practical. Camus collapses the kind of theoretical wisdom and basically really wants to focus in on a practical wisdom. And in the philosophical language, that's the difference between like knowing the forms, if you remember your Plato, or if you never had Plato, knowing absolute truth versus I just got to like make a sandwich today and get out of bed, right? And that's different kinds of knowledge. And so Camus really is, I think, is pushing on a more practical knowledge, and then to make it kind of, applicable, the idea would be that you really need to start thinking not so much about what's happening in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Portland, Oregon, or Washington, D.C. Those are important things, and they trickle down into our community here. But the community that you're actually primarily, the way Camus would say it, that you've been quarantined to and exiled with, that you just find yourself in right now, is here. So what is it that you can do here that may or may not bubble up into the national or the big level, but actually can help us here overcome what Camus talks about as the instinct of death, which is just our usual ability to kind of tear and to break things down and kind of like not care about what's happening here, because what's happening in Portland is a lot more important right now, or what's happening in D.C. is a lot more important right now. And that's a hard one, because there's no algorithm for that, and that's where that kind of idea of the world just kind of thrusts you into certain situations. We're not really good at that, because we want to know how to extract ourselves from it. But you're going to be forced into certain relationships that you just kind of have to work with, and a lot of them are going to, on the personal level. I'm not talking about like professor students or whatever, but a lot of them on a personal level are just ones you wouldn't really choose on your own. But here we are, forced to live together. So, find ways to alleviate death in whatever ways you can. And that might just simply be like, being nice to the person that you don't really want to even smile at. And look, I'll tell you, this is not my life. This is not the way I live. I'm going to have frowns more than smiles. No, not really. But, he reminds us that, a lot of what we do just in this local community is going to pay larger dividends for us struggling through this life together than putting our concerns on larger scales. But the larger scales are that's what gets us excited, right? And especially in an election year. So it's tough. And it's not, that those things don't matter. They do, but we have to, again, measure our passions for what is happening around us versus what's happening that's literally outside of our control, right? Again, maybe that's not practical enough, but...
Either way, give the man a golf clap, yeah?